In the Shadow of the King, The Secret Life of Pablo Escobar. The rain fell gently over Medellín on December 2nd, 1993, its soft murmur blending with the city's sounds. On the roof of a modest house, surrounded by hills, a man lay still, his face turned toward the sky. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, the king of cocaine, had just fallen to the bullets of law enforcement. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, as if contemplating one last time the world he had ruled, manipulated, and, in some way, loved. The traces of his life, a blend of power, violence, passion, and tragedy, faded softly into the falling rain. Chaos unfolded around him. Radios crackled, agents shouted orders, and helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights slicing the scene with a cold, impersonal glow. For the man who had defied the government, the CIA, and the laws of the world, it all ended here, on this rooftop, with a bullet to the heart. Yet, this moment was merely the epilogue of an extraordinarily complex life. To understand this man, one must go back long before that fateful day. One must return to where it all began. Medellín, 1949. A city in transformation where the dusty streets of poor neighborhoods stood side by side with the luxurious homes of the wealthy. In a small brick house nestled in the hills, a cry echoed. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria had just been born. It was a calm night, but inside this modest house, activity was frantic. Hermilda, his mother, looked at her newborn son with a mix of exhaustion and pride. "Welcome to this world, Mijo," she murmured. "May your life be better than ours." This simple phrase summed up the hopes of a family. Abel, Pablo's father, was a quiet man, a resigned farmer. His calloused hands told the story of years spent cultivating land that never yielded enough. Hermilda, on the other hand, was a schoolteacher, proud of her role in the community, but frustrated by the limits of her position. From an early age, Pablo absorbed this duality, a patient but subdued father and a demanding mother, always striving for something more. Life in this modest home was simple but full of humanity. Meals were made of typical dishes, beans, rice, and, on fortunate days, a piece of meat. In the evenings, after dinner, Hermilda would gather her children to tell stories or teach them life lessons. But even as a young boy, Pablo wasn't content just to dream. He asked questions, too many questions. One day, at just 5 years old, he asked his mother, "Mama, why do rich people live in big houses and we live in a small one?" Surprised by such a mature reflection, Hermilda answered gently, "Because they've found a way to take more than they give. But if you work hard and are clever, you can have whatever you want." Pablo said nothing, but his mind was already working. Those words, spoken almost casually, became a sort of creed for him. He wouldn't accept the world as it was. He would change it, or at least bend it to his will. The streets of Medellín were both fascinating and merciless. In the neighborhood where Pablo grew up, children played barefoot in the dust, improvising soccer games with worn-out balls. The adults, meanwhile, discussed the day's news or their economic struggles. But what intrigued young Pablo were not the games or the chatter. It was the whispered conversations, the ones about power. He often slipped close to men talking in the shadows. There, he heard words like business, control, and opportunities. He didn't understand everything, but he knew one thing: these men had influence over their surroundings. They didn't endure their fate, they shaped it. One afternoon, as he lingered near a group of young men, one of them called out to him, "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" Pablo, undeterred, replied, "Listening." The men burst into laughter, amused by the audacity of the boy with piercing dark eyes. "And what do you want to learn?" one of them asked. Fixing his gaze on the speaker with a sly smile, Pablo replied, "How to be like you." Such a response, coming from a child, often left adults perplexed. But for Pablo, these moments were valuable lessons. He observed, he listened, and above all, he remembered. In these narrow and noisy streets, he learned that the world belongs to those daring enough to take it. As Pablo grew older, his ambition became an unstoppable force. But in a city marked by inequality and power struggles, what choices would shape his destiny? Pablo's first steps down the path of crime would soon leave an indelible mark. The sun set over Medellín, casting the hills in golden light. In the dusty alleys of Pablo's neighborhood, an odd energy seemed to linger. Children shouted, playing makeshift games, while adults, weary from a long day's work, gathered on their doorsteps to chat, share a beer, or simply observe the quiet chaos of the evening. But Pablo had other concerns. Sitting on an old wooden bench near the neighborhood square, he talked to Gustavo, his cousin and inseparable friend. Gustavo was a bit more reserved than Pablo, but just as intelligent. Together, they formed an inseparable duo, a mix of caution and daring. "Listen, Gustavo," said Pablo, scratching the ground with his foot, his eyes fixed on an invisible point. "We're not going to stay like this forever. I have an idea." "Another one of your ideas, Pablo? You know your mom will kill you if she finds out what we're up to." "My mom?" replied Pablo with a mocking smile. "She wants me to succeed, right? Well, I'm going to succeed. But to do that, we have to start somewhere." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, rusty knife. "See this? With this, we can open any lock. I've spotted a warehouse not far from here. They store bikes there. We steal one or two, sell them, and that's it. Simple." Gustavo hesitated, looking around as if to make sure no one was listening. "And if we get caught?" "You know what Don Ernesto said. Anyone who steals in his neighborhood gets a hand chopped off." "Don Ernesto?" Pablo said, chuckling softly. "He won't even know it was us. And besides, we're not stealing from people in the neighborhood. We're stealing from the rich, those who can afford it. That night, under an almost full moon, the two boys slipped through the dark streets, avoiding the sporadic patrols of the local police. Dogs barked in the distance, but nothing seemed to shake their determination. The warehouse in question was a small, half-dilapidated wooden building at the edge of the neighborhood. Pablo approached it silently, pulling out his knife. With surprising skill for his age, he broke the lock in just a few minutes. Done, he whispered with a triumphant smile. "Get in." Gustavo reluctantly followed, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the air smelled of grease and metal. Bicycles, in good condition, were lined up against a wall. Pablo grabbed one and pushed it toward the exit. "Just one for tonight," he whispered. "We'll come back for the others later." Gustavo nodded, but he couldn't stop casting nervous glances around. "We should leave now, Pablo." As they exited the warehouse, the sound of footsteps echoed from a nearby alley. Gustavo froze, grabbing Pablo's arm. "Someone's coming." "Calm down," Pablo replied through clenched teeth. "It's probably just a drunk. Keep walking like nothing's wrong." The footsteps receded, and the boys managed to return home without incident. But for Gustavo, that night remained etched in his memory as a lesson in caution. For Pablo, it was the start of a long series. The next morning, the two boys sought out an old man known for buying goods of dubious origin. Don Ignacio, seated on a rickety chair in front of his shop, greeted them with a toothless smile. "So, boys, what do you have for me today?" Pablo pushed the bike forward, a confident smile on his face. "A nearly new bike. You can sell it easily." Don Ignacio examined the bike, frowning slightly. "Where did you get this?" "That's not important," Pablo replied coolly. "The question is, how much will you give us?" The old man burst into laughter, amused by the young boy's audacity. "You're clever, aren't you?" "Fine, I'll give you 5 pesos. "No more." 10, Pablo countered without hesitation. "Or we'll take it somewhere else." Ignacio squinted, sizing up the boy. He saw something rare in him, an almost frightening confidence for someone his age. "All right, 10 pesos, he finally said. "But next time, bring me something better." With those 10 pesos in hand, Pablo felt invincible. It wasn't just the money, it was what it represented, a victory against a system that always seemed stacked against him. He spent the day dreaming about what he could do next. Gustavo, on the other hand, remained silent. "You should slow down, Pablo," he told him that evening. "It's just a bike. If you keep this up, you'll get into trouble." "Slow down?" Pablo said with a shrug. "Look around you. No one slows down in this world. The rich don't slow down. Politicians don't slow down. So why should I?" Pablo stared at his cousin, his gaze burning with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "Trust me, Gustavo. This is just the beginning." That first experience of theft was merely a stepping stone. But what happens when such an ambitious and cunning mind encounters far more lucrative opportunities and far greater dangers? The midday sun beat mercilessly on the dusty streets of Medellín, making the tin roofs glisten and turning the narrow alleys into virtual furnaces. The sounds of the city filled the air, street vendors shouting about their wares, radios crackling with salsa music, and, in the background, the laughter and shouts of children playing soccer. But Pablo, now 11 years old, no longer played. He had other plans. Sitting on a wooden crate in a narrow alley, he talked with Gustavo, who watched him with concern. Beside them was another boy, Fabio, a neighbor known for his shady connections. He listened with a mocking smile. "So, Pablo," Fabio murmured, that familiar smirk on his lips, "you want to play with the big boys now?" "I don't want to play," Pablo retorted, crossing his arms. "I want to win." Fabio burst out laughing, but quickly stopped when he saw the seriousness in Pablo's eyes. "You know, kid, winning isn't just about stealing bikes. That's for children. If you really want to win, you need to get into the real business." Pablo didn't look away, captivated by Fabio's words. "What kind of business?" Fabio leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Cigarettes, bootleg alcohol, maybe a little powder. People pay good money for that, especially the rich. Do you want to keep selling bikes? Or do you want to become someone who matters?" Gustavo, who had remained silent until then, spoke up, worried. "This is dangerous, Pablo. If we get caught, it won't just be a warning from Don Ernesto. It'll be the police, or worse." Pablo turned to his cousin, his expression hard. "The police? They don't care about poor people like us. And even if they catch us, we'll find a way. Gustavo, if you want to stay poor your whole life, that's your choice. But I want something more." This conversation marked a turning point. A few days later, Fabio introduced Pablo and Gustavo to his boss, Don Alvaro, a man in his 40s known throughout the neighborhood as the king of smuggling. Don Alvaro wasn't physically imposing. Short and stocky, he always wore a black hat and a half-smoked cigar between his lips. But his piercing gaze alone was enough to command respect. Pablo and Gustavo stood before him in a small, dimly lit room at the back of a cantina. The walls, lined with old bullfighting posters, seemed to absorb the stifling afternoon heat. A table cluttered with papers, money, and weapons dominated the center of the room. "So, you're the new kids?" Don Alvaro said, examining them from head to toe. Pablo stepped forward, ignoring Gustavo's nervous glance. "Yes, senor. And I'm ready to work." A silence followed his words. Don Alvaro, amused by the boy's audacity, took a long drag from his cigar before responding. Ready to work, huh? And what can you do, kid? Pablo met his gaze without flinching. Anything you want. Give me a task and I'll prove I can do it. Don Alvaro burst into laughter, a hoarse laugh that echoed through the room. Fine. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Fabio, give them a shipment of cigarettes and show them where to deliver it. If everything goes smoothly, we'll talk about the rest. A few hours later, Pablo and Gustavo found themselves in an old van loaded with cartons of smuggled cigarettes. Fabio was driving, explaining the rules along the way. Listen carefully, boys. No questions. No unnecessary stops. And above all, no trouble. If someone stops you, you don't know anything, got it? Pablo nodded without hesitation, while Gustavo seemed more nervous. The delivery was to be made in a neighboring district to a shopkeeper who, according to Fabio, knew how to keep his mouth shut. When they arrived, Pablo took the lead, knocking on the door with confidence. A middle-aged man opened it, giving the boys a quick once-over before letting them in. This your first delivery, huh? He said, pointing to the cartons. Be careful. In this business, mistakes are costly. Pablo said nothing, unloading the cartons with near military efficiency. Once the task was done, he held out his hand to receive the payment. Amused by his boldness, the man handed him a thick envelope. On the way back, Fabio glanced at Pablo in the rearview mirror, a smile of approval on his face. Not bad, kid. You learn fast. Back in the neighborhood, Pablo handed the envelope to Don Alvaro. The man quickly counted the money, nodding with satisfaction. Well done, kid. You could go far if you keep this up. Pablo said nothing, but inside he was jubilant. It wasn't just the money, it was the respect. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger. Gustavo, however, remained worried. Later that evening, as they sat on their usual bench, he confronted Pablo. We can't keep doing this, Pablo. It's going to end badly. End badly? Pablo replied with a shrug. Everything ends badly, Gustavo. What matters is what we do before the end. This response, typical of Pablo, already summed up the man he would become, someone willing to risk everything to get what he wanted. It was only the beginning of his rise, but already the first stones of his empire were being laid. With each mission, Pablo learned and gained confidence. But as he began to involve himself in riskier ventures, he attracted the attention of new allies and new enemies. Night fell over Medellín, cloaking the streets in tranquil darkness. Pablo, now 16 years old, had earned a quiet but solid reputation in the underbelly of the city. Each mission, each transaction, strengthened his confidence. But that night, everything was about to change. A delivery that was supposed to be simple would turn into his first confrontation with authority, revealing even more about the man he was destined to become. The mission seemed straightforward: transport a load of smuggled whiskey to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Gustavo, as always, was with him. But this time, Don Alvaro had added a third man to the team, Rogelio, an older guy known for his nervousness and loose tongue. "Listen," Rogelio said, glancing at Pablo from the passenger seat, "this isn't some kid's game this time. We're talking serious money. If you screw up, it's my neck on the line." Pablo, seated in the back with Gustavo, remained calm, arms crossed. "We don't screw up," he replied tersely. The van crawled along bumpy roads lit by the flickering glow of streetlights. The cartons of whiskey, neatly stacked, emitted a faintly sweet smell. Pablo stared out the window, mentally calculating how long it would take to reach their destination. But an inner voice told him something wasn't right. As they approached a dilapidated bridge, a police car suddenly appeared in front of them, blocking the road. The flashing lights painted the night in red and blue, their beams cutting through the tense faces of the three men. "Damn it," Rogelio muttered, his face pale as a sheet. Pablo stayed calm, though he felt his heartbeat quicken. He watched as two officers exited their vehicle, their weapons visible at their hips. "Act like nothing's wrong," he said softly. "We have nothing to hide." The officers approached, their boots echoing on the asphalt. One of them, a tall, burly man with an imposing mustache, knocked on Rogelio's window. "Step out," he ordered. Rogelio obeyed, trembling. Pablo and Gustavo exchanged a glance. "We're screwed," Gustavo murmured. "Not yet," Pablo replied as he opened the door and stepped out. The three men now stood in front of the van under the piercing gaze of the police officers. "What are you transporting?" the mustachioed officer asked in an accusatory tone. Pablo stepped forward slightly, speaking before Rogelio could answer. "Supplies for a warehouse, senor. Nothing illegal." The officer squinted, skeptical. He gestured to his younger colleague, who opened the back of the van. Seeing the cartons of whiskey, the younger officer let out a low whistle. "Supplies, huh? You know it's illegal to transport this kind of stuff without proper authorization?" Pablo didn't flinch. "I didn't know that, senor. I'm just paid to drive. That's all." The mustachioed officer stepped closer, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "You think I'm stupid, kid?" Pablo held his gaze, impassive. "No, senor. But I think every problem has a solution." Time seemed to stand still. Gustavo held his breath. Rogelio opened his mouth to speak, but Pablo shot him a look that silenced him. The mustachioed officer burst out laughing, a rough, sarcastic laugh. "You're clever, kid. Very clever. So, what's your solution?" Pablo slowly pulled an envelope from his pocket containing part of the money Don Alvaro had given them for the delivery. "Maybe we can make your evening a bit more pleasant, senor." The officer grabbed the envelope, opened it, and quickly counted the bills. He nodded, satisfied. "All right, get out of here. But if I see you again, it won't be this easy." The three men climbed back into the van, silence reigning. Gustavo looked at Pablo with a mix of admiration and concern. "You just bribed a cop, Pablo," he murmured. "Do you know what that means?" "Yes," Pablo replied, staring straight ahead. "It means everyone has a price." Back at Don Alvaro's, they recounted the incident. The boss, far from being angry, burst out laughing. "That kid is made for this business," he said, patting Pablo on the back. "So young and already willing to do whatever it takes." Pablo remained silent, but deep down, he knew this moment was a turning point. It wasn't just a successful delivery. It was a lesson about how power worked. Those willing to take risks ultimately rule. With this first confrontation, Pablo realized that money and power could open doors brute force never could. But in a world where everything has a price, what sacrifices would come next? Night enveloped Medellín in deceptive calm, broken only by the distant murmurs of the bustling streets. Pablo Escobar, barely 21 years old, had become a familiar face among the influential men of the neighborhood. But this wasn't enough for him. He didn't just want to survive in this world, he wanted to dominate it. To do so, he needed powerful allies, men who saw the world as he did, not through the lens of laws, but through the prism of opportunities. Elias Vargas, nicknamed El Tiburon, the shark, for his ability to sniff out lucrative deals, was a key figure in Colombia's cocaine trade. Tall, imposing, with a deep voice and piercing eyes, he ruled his territory with an iron fist. He was known for trusting only those who took calculated risks. Pablo knew he needed a man like him. One evening, in a discreet bar on the outskirts of the city, Pablo found himself face to face with Elias. The smoky room echoed with laughter and salsa music. Pablo approached a table in the back where Elias, flanked by two armed men, was sipping a glass of rum. "Senor Vargas," Pablo said confidently, "my name is Pablo Escobar. I'd like to discuss a partnership." Elias raised an eyebrow, amused by the audacity of the young, unknown man. "A partnership?" he repeated, setting down his glass. "And what could a kid like you possibly offer me?" Pablo didn't flinch. "I can offer you something few people have around here, ambition without limits." Elias burst out laughing, a hoarse laugh that caught the attention of his men. "Ambition without limits, huh? All right, kid, sit down. Let's talk." The conversation lasted for hours. Pablo explained how he envisioned business, a well-organized structure, secure smuggling routes, and a strict hierarchy. Initially skeptical, Elias was impressed by the young man's clarity and determination. But he wanted to test him. "All right, Pablo. You talk a good game. But words are easy. Here's what I want. A shipment of cocaine needs to cross the border. It's risky. If you succeed, we'll talk about your so-called partnership. If you fail, well, you won't be around to discuss it. Pablo nodded without hesitation. Consider it done. A few days later, Pablo stood in a dimly lit warehouse, supervising the loading of a truck. Gustavo was there, as always, his face tense. Pablo, we're not talking about cigarettes or whiskey this time. This is cocaine. If we get caught. We won't get caught, Pablo interrupted. Trust me. The truck needed to pass through a route controlled by a rival group. Pablo knew that success would require negotiation and intimidation. He had learned that in this world, respect and fear often went hand in hand. At an improvised checkpoint, a group of armed men stopped them. Their leader, a scrawny man with a scar running across his face, approached. "What are you transporting?" he asked, pointing his rifle at the driver. Pablo stepped out of the truck, his expression calm. "Nothing that concerns you. But I can guarantee that what we're carrying makes more money than anything you've seen this month." The man narrowed his eyes, hesitating. Pablo handed him a thick stack of bills. "This is for your silence. And if you're smart, there'll be more next time." After a moment of tension, the man took the money and signaled his men to let them pass. Gustavo, who had remained silent throughout, let out a sigh of relief. "You're playing with fire, Pablo." "Maybe," Pablo replied with a smile. "But look where it gets us." When Pablo returned to Elias with confirmation that the shipment had been delivered, he found the man playing cards in a luxurious villa. As Pablo entered, Elias put down his cards and smiled. "Well, kid, you did it. Maybe you're not just a smooth talker after all." Pablo sat across from him, his eyes locked on the man's face. "I don't just succeed, Senor Vargas. I win. And if we work together, we'll both win." Elias stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, Pablo. Welcome to the big leagues." This alliance marked a turning point in Pablo's life. With Elias's support, he gained access to resources, contacts, and protection that allowed him to evolve from a petty smuggler into a key player in Colombia's cocaine trade. But every victory came with sacrifices. The higher Pablo climbed, the higher the stakes became. With a relentless ambition and new allies, Pablo was preparing to expand his empire. But in a world where alliances break as easily as they are formed, who would be the first to betray him? The sun rose slowly over the hills of Medellín, bathing the city in soft golden light. But in the grand villa perched atop the heights, tranquility was scarce. Inside, Pablo Escobar paced back and forth in a spacious office. The walls were adorned with exuberant paintings and carefully framed family photos. A large map of Colombia covered an entire wall, marked with small red pins representing his transport routes. On the massive wooden table lay folders, stacks of cash, and scattered weapons, symbols of the duality of his empire, organization, and chaos. Seated in a chair by the window, Gustavo Gaviria, his loyal cousin and trusted strategist, watched Pablo with a worried expression. "Pablo," he said finally, "we've reached a critical size. If we keep growing like this, it'll be impossible to avoid the authorities' attention." Pablo stopped, resting his hands on the table and fixing Gustavo with his piercing gaze. "The authorities? Gustavo, they're already in our pocket. The police, the judges, even the politicians. Everyone eats at our table. That's not what worries me." "Then what?" Gustavo asked, intrigued. Pablo straightened, walking toward the map on the wall. He pointed to a region near the Peruvian border. "What worries me is that we don't yet control production. As long as we depend on others' laboratories, we're vulnerable. I want to build our own facilities, secure our supply chain from start to finish." Gustavo frowned. "That's risky. It'll take resources and draw more attention." Pablo shrugged, a confident smile playing on his lips. "Every great victory requires risks. Gustavo, we're not here to stay small. We're here to rule." A few weeks later, Pablo launched the operation. A team of builders, chemists, and armed guards was sent to a remote region in the Amazon jungle. The location was ideal, isolated, difficult to access, and hidden from prying eyes. The jungle, with its constant hum of insects and unseen creatures, created an oppressive atmosphere. The workers, despite their experience, remained vigilant. The laboratories quickly took shape: wooden huts for production, warehouses for storage, and even a rudimentary airstrip for transport planes. Pablo visited the site a few months after construction began. Standing in the middle of the clearing, he surveyed the facilities with satisfaction. Beside him, an experienced chemist explained the processes. "With this setup, Senor Escobar, we can produce up to 5 tons per month." Pablo nodded, a satisfied smile on his lips. "Perfect. We've just become untouchable." However, an empire cannot be built alone. Pablo knew he needed reinforcements, not just to protect his new facilities, but also to expand his distribution network. He turned to a group of influential men from other regions, the Ochoa brothers, known for their wealth and power in cattle trading, as well as for their discretion. The meeting took place at a luxurious ranch owned by the Ochoas. Pablo arrived by helicopter, accompanied by Gustavo and a small group of armed guards. As he disembarked, he was greeted by Jorge Luis Ochoa, the eldest brother, an imposing man with a calculating gaze. "Senor Escobar," Jorge said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to have you here." Pablo shook his hand firmly, a courteous smile on his face. "The honor is mine. I've heard you know how to grow an empire. Perhaps we can work together." Over a table laden with sumptuous dishes, the two men talked. Jorge, ever cautious, asked detailed questions about Pablo's plans. "What you're proposing, Pablo, is ambitious. But how do you plan to avoid conflicts with other cartels? Pablo calmly set down his glass of wine before responding. Cooperation. Where others see enemies, I see partners. If someone wants war, they'll get it. But if someone wants peace, they'll have a seat at our table. With the Ochoas as allies, Pablo fortified his empire. Distribution routes expanded, reaching not only the United States, but also Europe and other parts of the world. The profits were astronomical. Cash piled up to the point of filling entire warehouses. Yet, with this rapid expansion came new tensions. Rival cartels began feeling the pressure of Pablo's growing influence. Threats were exchanged, ambushes laid. During a meeting at his villa, Gustavo warned Pablo. "We're moving too fast, Pablo. The Cali cartel is getting restless. They won't stay quiet for long." Pablo laughed, his laughter echoing through the room. "Gustavo, you worry too much. The Cali cartel can talk all they want, but they know they can't beat us. Not on our turf." But Pablo underestimated his enemies. In the shadows, an alliance was forming to counter his growing power. Meanwhile, under international pressure, the authorities began intensifying their efforts to dismantle his empire. The twilight blanketed Medellín, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In his luxurious villa, which resembled a fortress, Pablo Escobar sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, studying a detailed map of his transportation routes. His thin mustache framed a confident smile, but his piercing eyes betrayed an underlying tension. The empire he had built, though thriving, was beginning to show cracks. Gustavo entered the room, carrying a thick folder. His face was grim, his brow furrowed. He placed the folder on the desk with a thud. "Pablo, we have a problem," he said gravely. Pablo, as calm as ever, lit a cigar, took a puff, and fixed his gaze on Gustavo. "How many times have you told me that this year, cousin? I'm starting to think you're aging faster than me." "This isn't about age," Gustavo retorted, leaning slightly over the desk. "The Cali cartel intercepted one of our shipments. 3 tons, Pablo. 3 tons of cocaine taken on our routes." Pablo's smile faded slowly. He crushed the cigar in a crystal ashtray, then opened the folder. Inside were photos of the seized shipment and detailed reports. "And the men?" he asked without looking up. "3 dead, 2 missing," Gustavo replied. Pablo closed the folder and stood up, clasping his hands behind his back. He walked toward a large window offering a panoramic view of Medellín. The city lights sparkled like terrestrial stars, but for the first time they seemed dim. "They want to test our limits," he murmured. Gustavo approached cautiously. "What do we do?" Pablo turned, his eyes gleaming with cold determination. "We show them there are no limits." A few days later, a meeting was held at an isolated hacienda owned by Pablo. Present were the Ochoa brothers, several division leaders of his cartel, and a few trusted men. Pablo, dressed in a pristine white shirt, stood at the head of a long rustic wooden table. "My friends," he said, meeting each person's eyes, "we're facing an enemy that thinks it can weaken us. But they forget one thing: we're not just a cartel. We're a family." Jorge Luis Ochoa, known for his pragmatism, interjected, "A family, yes, but a family must be strategic. The Cali cartel has resources, Pablo. If we respond with too much violence, we risk drawing even more attention from the authorities." Pablo nodded, but his sly smile hinted at a different thought. "Jorge, I understand your point. But sometimes violence isn't an option, it's a necessity." He gestured to one of his men, who entered with a map of the region. Pablo leaned over, pointing to a small town controlled by Cali. "This town is a strategic point for them. If we take it, we send a clear message." Discussions continued late into the night, mixing disagreements, strategies, and vows of loyalty. Eventually, the plan was accepted. At dawn, a group of 20 armed men set out for Trujillo, a town under the Cali cartel's control. Under Pablo's orders, nothing was left to chance. Roads were blocked, warehouses raided, and guards eliminated with cold precision. Pablo stayed behind, supervising the operation from his villa. He received constant updates via radio, his expression impassive. Gustavo, seated beside him, seemed less at ease. "What if this backfires on us?" he murmured. Pablo replied without taking his eyes off the radio. "Everything we do comes back to us, Gustavo. The real question is it worth it?" A few hours later, confirmation arrived. Trujillo was under their control. Their losses were minimal, and Cali's warehouses had been burned to the ground. But victory came at a cost. The raid on Trujillo drew attention not only from rival cartels, but also from local and international authorities. Reports began circulating, describing a Medellín cartel more powerful and violent than ever. A week after the raid, Pablo received a call from his lawyer, Guillermo. "Pablo, the newspapers are starting to talk about you. Not in a good way. The DEA is stepping up its efforts. They're coming for you." Pablo, seated in a leather armchair, replied calmly, "They can look for me, Guillermo. They won't find anything." "Maybe not yet," Guillermo said with a sigh. "But you should consider diversifying your operations. You're too visible." Pablo hung up, thoughtful. This visibility, once a source of power, was now becoming a liability. The first cracks were appearing in Pablo's empire. Between growing rivalries with Cali, mounting pressure from the authorities, and internal tensions, the man who once seemed invincible was starting to realize that every move in this game of power could be fatal. That evening, Medellín's air was heavy, an oppressive heat mirroring the rising tension in Pablo Escobar's empire. Sitting in an elegantly decorated room in his villa, surrounded by his advisors, and Gustavo, Pablo sipped a glass of rum. But tonight, his mind wasn't on shipments or rivalries with the Cali cartel. No, tonight he dreamed of something bigger. Gustavo, Pablo said, rising with an enigmatic smile, we've made a lot of money. But it's not enough. If we really want to be untouchable, I need to become one of them. Gustavo, seated at a table flipping through a report on their transport routes, looked up, perplexed. One of them? What do you mean? Pablo turned to him, arms spread wide as if announcing the obvious. Politicians, Gustavo. Lawmakers. The ones who write the rules. If I'm inside the system, no one will ever be able to take me out. The room fell into heavy silence. Jorge Ochoa, also present that evening, frowned. Pablo, politics is a dangerous game. It's not like what we do here. Out there, everything is public, every move is scrutinized. Pablo set his glass on the table and fixed Jorge with a steely gaze. And that's exactly why I need to do it. Imagine what it means for us, a seat in Congress, the perfect cover for our business. Who would dare touch us if I become a statesman? A few weeks later, Pablo launched his campaign. His strategy was clear: to lean into his image as a modern Robin Hood. Using cartel money, he funded projects in Medellin's poor neighborhoods, soccer fields, schools, and homes for the homeless. One morning, in a struggling neighborhood, Pablo stood amidst an enthusiastic crowd. Dressed in a simple shirt, he smiled, shook hands, and listened to the grievances of the residents. An elderly woman approached him, holding a young boy by the hand. "Senor Escobar," she said, "you're the only one helping us. All these politicians, they don't even see us. But you're one of us." Pablo knelt to the boy's height and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm here for that, Senora. Because no one should live the way you do. Trust me, I'll change things." Applause erupted from the crowd. Gustavo, watching the scene from a nearby car, turned to Jorge. He knows exactly how to manipulate them. Jorge nodded. "Yes, but this visibility is going to bring trouble." In 1984, thanks to a carefully orchestrated campaign and promises of change, Pablo was elected as an alternate congressman in Colombia. His entry into parliament was unforgettable. Wearing a pristine suit, he walked through the marble corridors of the government building, a confident smile on his face. But behind that smile lay a cold determination. An audacious journalist, Santiago Olivares, intercepted him as he entered the chamber. "Senor Escobar, some say your money comes from illegal activities. How do you respond to that?" Pablo stopped, staring directly at the journalist. "I'm a businessman, senor. My money comes from trade, hard work, and luck. Those who talk without proof are simply jealous." Not everyone shared the enthusiasm of Pablo's supporters. An influential politician, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, Colombia's Minister of Justice, saw Pablo as a threat. During a press conference, Rodrigo declared, "We cannot allow criminals to infiltrate our institutions. Pablo Escobar is a stain on the honor of our country." These words quickly reached Pablo. That evening, in his villa, surrounded by Gustavo and his top lieutenants, he slammed his fist on the table. Rodrigo Lara wants to play the hero? Then he'll pay the price. Gustavo tried to calm him. "Pablo, this type of enemy is different. He has the support of the government and the United States. If you go too far, they'll all come after you." But Pablo wasn't listening. "Gustavo, these men think they can dictate my actions. They need to learn that no one dictates my actions." A few months later, Rodrigo Lara was gunned down by men on motorcycles as he was returning home. The assassination shook the nation. Newspapers screamed about the escalation of violence, and all eyes turned to Pablo. But far from hiding, he continued playing his role as a public benefactor. During a press conference held shortly afterward, a journalist dared to ask him directly, "Senor Escobar, did you have anything to do with Rodrigo Lara's death?" Pablo stared into the camera, his face impassive. "I regret Rodrigo Lara's death, just as I regret every unnecessary death. But I had nothing to do with it. I am a man of peace." Behind this facade, Pablo knew that times had changed. The assassination of Rodrigo Lara had drawn international attention, and the pressure on his empire became unbearable. The first cracks turned into chasms, threatening to swallow everything he had built. Night fell over Medellín, but the city never slept. Police sirens echoed through the streets, mingling with the crackle of radios announcing new raids. In his luxurious villa, Pablo Escobar stood in front of a large map of Colombia. Transportation routes, hidden laboratories, and rival checkpoints were meticulously marked with pins. Beside him, Gustavo Gaviria, his loyal cousin, watched in silence. Pablo took a deep breath, resting a firm hand on the map. "They want war, Gustavo," he said gravely. "Then we'll give them a war they'll never forget." Gustavo frowned, crossing his arms. "Pablo, it's no longer just our rivals. The Americans are involved now. The DEA, the CIA. This isn't a fight we can win with bullets." Pablo turned, fixing his cousin with a cold, intense stare. "Then tell me, Gustavo, how do we win? By sending them flowers?" A few days later, Medellín trembled. At dawn, a car bomb exploded outside a central police station, destroying the facade and killing several officers. Pablo, seated in his living room, listened to the news on the radio while sipping coffee. His lieutenants, gathered around him, looked tense. Jorge Ochoa, one of his most influential allies, spoke up. "Pablo, I'm not saying it wasn't effective, but these attacks are drawing even more attention. The international press is calling us terrorists now. Pablo set his cup down on the glass table with a sharp clink. Jorge, you don't understand. Fear is our most powerful weapon. If we show them we're willing to do anything, even burn this city if necessary, they'll think twice before coming after us. The men exchanged uncertain glances, but no one dared contradict Pablo. It was clear he would stop at nothing to protect his empire. The conflict reached new heights when Avianca Flight 203, a commercial airliner, exploded mid-flight, killing all passengers on board. Pablo had ordered the attack to eliminate a politician he suspected of collaborating with American authorities. Gustavo, horrified by the news, confronted Pablo in his office. Pablo, you blew up a plane full of innocent people. Families, children. What's wrong with you? Pablo, calmly seated behind his desk, looked up at Gustavo. Gustavo, do you think these politicians care about the innocent? Do you think they'd hesitate for a second to kill our families if it suited them? This is war. And in war, there are no rules. Gustavo slammed his fist on the table. But look at what it's made you, Pablo. You've become worse than the people you're fighting. A heavy silence fell over the room. Pablo rose slowly and approached Gustavo. Listen to me, cousin. Everything I do for us. For you, for your family, for everything we've built. If you're not willing to do what it takes, then you don't belong here. Meanwhile, the authorities intensified their efforts. The DEA and Colombian police coordinated raids, seized shipments, and captured cartel members. But Pablo, always one step ahead, used his network of informants to avoid the worst blows. One evening, as he was having dinner with his family, his phone rang. It was Guillermo, his lawyer and trusted confidant. Pablo, the DEA has discovered one of our airstrips near the border. They're planning a raid. Pablo set down his fork slowly, his expression hardening. How much time do we have? A few hours, maybe less, Guillermo replied. Pablo immediately stood and ordered his men to clear the site. By the time the DEA agents arrived, they found nothing but an empty field, the ground marked with tire tracks, but no planes or drugs. Despite his tactical successes, the losses mounted. Money still flowed freely, but the human cost and constant pressure began to weigh on Pablo. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he confided in Gustavo one night as they shared a bottle of whiskey on the villa's terrace. You know, Gustavo, sometimes I wonder if all this is worth it. Gustavo, surprised, looked at him for a long moment before responding. It's not for me to say, Pablo. You chose this path. But if you keep going like this, there will be nothing left to come back to. Pablo nodded, gazing at the lights of the city below. But behind his tired eyes, the spark of a man who refused to stop still burned. As the war reached its peak, Pablo found himself at a crossroads. Every decision he made could either strengthen his empire or hasten its collapse. Enemies multiplied, Allies grew scarce, and even those closest to him began to doubt. The hills of Medellín, once a symbol of Pablo Escobar's power, now seemed to cast a shadow over his empire. His men, worn down by years of open warfare, felt the tension mounting. Attacks from authorities, rival cartels, and even former allies became more frequent. Ever calculating, Pablo began to realize that the tides were turning. One morning in 1986, Gustavo burst into Pablo's expansive office, clutching a dossier. Pablo, seated behind his cluttered desk, barely looked up, dark circles visible under his eyes. "Gustavo," he said calmly, "what couldn't wait?" Gustavo slammed the dossier onto the table. "The Americans, Pablo. They're putting everything on us now. The president just signed an extradition treaty. They want Colombia to hand us over." Pablo leaned back, a sarcastic smile forming on his lips. "Extradition? They think they can send me to America? Gustavo, I'm safer here than anywhere else." "Not if we keep going like this," Gustavo countered. "The Cali cartel is making deals with the government. They're selling us out to save themselves." A heavy silence followed. Pablo stood up, walking to the window. He stared at the hills, his gaze fixed on an invisible horizon. Then, "Gustavo, if Colombia wants to extradite me, I'll have to become Colombia." Pablo intensified his efforts to infiltrate the political system. He began funding local campaigns, bribing judges, and eliminating politicians who refused to cooperate. But his public image, already tarnished by years of violence, proved difficult to repair. Colombian newspapers painted him as the face of evil. One evening, during a meeting at his villa, Pablo addressed his top lieutenants. Around the large wooden table, the atmosphere was tense. "My friends," he said, "it's time to launch a new campaign. We need to show the people that I'm their protector, not their enemy." Jorge Ochoa, always cautious, spoke up. "Pablo, the people loved you once. But now they're afraid. The violence has changed things." Pablo locked eyes with Jorge, his expression cold. "And you think fear isn't a weapon, Jorge? I'm both their protector and their nightmare. If we control fear, we control everything." In the months that followed, Pablo launched a campaign of terror to force the government to abandon the extradition treaty. Car bombings became a common tactic. Each attack carried a clear message: plata o plomo, silver or lead. But while effective, this strategy increasingly isolated Pablo from his allies. One day, Gustavo, ever the voice of reason, tried to talk sense into his cousin. "Pablo, look around you. Even our friends are starting to turn against us. If we keep this up, we'll be completely alone." Pablo, staring into his glass of whiskey, replied in a low but firm voice, "Gustavo, I started alone. If I have to end alone, so be it. But I'll never surrender." By 1989, The cracks in the Medellín cartel had turned into chasms. The Ochoa brothers, under pressure from the authorities, negotiated their surrender to avoid extradition. During one final meeting with Pablo, Jorge Ochoa tried to justify their decision. "Pablo, this isn't betrayal. It's about survival. We can't keep going like this." Standing before him, Pablo clenched his fists. "Survival? Jorge, do you think living on your knees is survival? You disappoint me." Jorge lowered his gaze but said nothing. He knew his choice had severed their alliance. Under constant pressure, Pablo decided to retreat to one of his hideouts, La Catedral, a luxurious prison he had built for himself. There, surrounded by his last loyalists, he tried to maintain some control over his crumbling empire. Even at La Catedral, tensions ran high. One particularly tense night, one of Pablo's lieutenants, Ariel, dared to confront him. "Pablo, we're losing everything. The roots, the money, the men. And you're just sitting here, drinking and waiting." Pablo shot up from his chair, his anger erupting like a storm. "You think I don't see what's happening, Ariel? You think I'm hiding? Every decision I make here, every minute, is so we survive. But if you want to leave, go. And don't come back." Intimidated, Ariel backed away without a word. Gustavo, who had witnessed the scene, placed a hand on Pablo's shoulder. "Cousin, you need to calm down. If we lose the men, we lose everything." Pablo, now isolated, felt the end drawing near. But he was not one to give up. As he gazed out from a window at La Catedral, one thought crossed his mind: if he were to fall, it would be in a way the world would never forget. Dusk fell over Medellín, but the city remained restless. In the streets, the sounds of life blended with murmurs of fear and fascination for Pablo Escobar. But this time, admiration had been replaced by suspicion. The man who once dominated Medellín's hills watched as his empire crumbled. To Colombian and American authorities, he was no longer a king, he was prey. The authorities, with U.S. support, had formed a special task force, the Search Block, created exclusively to capture or eliminate Escobar. Led by Colonel Hugo Martinez, the group spared no effort. Every day, raids targeted Escobar's hideouts, laboratories, and lieutenants. In a makeshift bunker outside Medellín, Pablo, surrounded by Gustavo and a few loyal men, listened to a report from one of his informants. The atmosphere was heavy, faces tense. "Senor Escobar," the man said, "we lost 2 laboratories this morning. The Search Block is using information someone is feeding them." Pablo slowly turned to Gustavo, who was reviewing documents beside him. "Gustavo," he murmured, "do you think we have a traitor?" Gustavo looked up, meeting Pablo's gaze. "Pablo, with everything happening, it's not impossible. But we need to be careful. If you make a mistake, you lose what few allies you have left." Pablo slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing in the room. I don't have time to be careful, Gustavo. I want to know who's talking. And if someone is betraying us, they won't live to regret it. A few weeks later, the hardest blow for Pablo came, the death of Gustavo. During a raid by the search block, Gustavo was shot while attempting to escape from a hideout. The news reached Pablo in a safe house where he was hiding. Seated in a worn-out armchair, Pablo listened to the man delivering the news, his face frozen in an expression of silent shock. When the man finished, Pablo slowly rose and walked toward the window. The lights of the city sparkled in the distance, but for the first time they seemed dull. Maria Victoria, his wife, entered the room, visibly worried. "Pablo, what's wrong?" Pablo turned around, his eyes burning with both anger and pain. "Gustavo is dead. They killed him." Maria placed a hand on his arm, but he gently pushed her away, turning his back. "They will pay for this," he murmured. "Every man who took part in this. Every traitor. Every damn policeman." In the months that followed, Pablo launched a series of violent attacks against law enforcement and suspected informants. Car bombings exploded, police stations were attacked. But each attack only intensified the manhunt against him. The newspapers spoke increasingly about his crimes, his isolation, and the desertion of his former allies. One sleepless night, in a rudimentary hideout, Pablo spoke to his son, Juan Pablo. The boy, now a teenager, looked at his father with a mix of admiration and concern. "Dad," Juan Pablo whispered, "why can't we just run away? Why not leave everything behind?" Pablo ran his hand through his son's hair, his gaze drifting into the void. "Because running away is dying, Mijo. And your father will not die as a weak man." In December 1993, the search block traced Pablo to a house in Medellín thanks to a phone call he had made to his family. In this modest house, Pablo was with his bodyguard, Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, aka El Limón. They knew their time was running out. Crouched near a window, Pablo looked at El Limón. "They're close. We can't stay here." El Limón nodded, checking his weapon. "What do we do, boss?" Pablo took a deep breath, gripping his pistol in his hand. "We run. But they won't have me alive." As they attempted to escape across the rooftops, Pablo and El Limón were spotted by the authorities. A firefight broke out. Bullets flew, shattering tiles and tearing through the air. Pablo, wounded, crawled to the edge of a roof. The sound of helicopters echoed in his ears. Colonel Hugo Martinez, on the ground, gave the order. "Don't let him escape. If he moves, shoot." A bullet finally struck Pablo in the head. He fell to the roof, his face turned toward the sky. The police slowly approached, guns raised. The silence was deafening. Hugo Martinez stood over his body, a mixture of relief and solemnity on his face. "It's over," he murmured. Pablo Escobar was dead, but his name would continue to echo in the streets of Medellín and beyond. To some, he was a hero. To others, a monster. But for those who knew him closely, he was a man consumed by his own ambition, unable to free himself from the chains he had forged for himself.